Bindu Srivastava from TSDSI, and I'm very excited to bring this webinar on SEPs and IPRs in the technology-driven society, opportunities for SMEs. As you know, in this current technology-driven society, the innovations and their standardization are the way forward for people to leverage the work that they are doing, the innovation that they're bringing. I'm very happy to announce that Mr. K. Ramchand, Member Technology from Department of Telecommunications, is with us, and I invite him to make the opening remarks and set the context. Over to you, Mr. Ramchand.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me for this very important webinar. In fact, to admit very frankly, I am not the right person to give the opening remarks for this because I don't know anything about IPRs. Let me admit that. But I think then it is, I think, useful for people like me who don't know IPRs. I congratulate and thank TSDSI and Indians Jindal School of Banking Finance and Professor Ashish Bharadwaj and everybody who has organized this webinar. I was told by my team that in the global ICT market, system design and IPRs value around $1.1 trillion, while chipset design and its IPRs value around $350 billion. So, today with Atmanirbharta being announced by the Honorable Prime Minister and Government of India, and a lot of startups and Make in India programs coming in, I think it's India should take a lead to develop indigenous products in all sectors, and especially in the telecom sector. We are trying our best to have Indian technologies in the telecom sector, especially when 5G comes in, because I strongly feel that whoever controls the telecom infrastructure controls the infrastructure of the country. So, and then in that context, the IPRs become extremely important. The role of MSME, SMEs is very important in the growth of ICT, because the 4G and 5G, especially 5G technology, will be driven by applications, and it will affect all the sectors, including financial, power, transport, health, education, everything. So I hope the participants here would benefit from this webinar, know more about SEPs and IPRs. And without wasting your time, I would invite Mr. Patak and Professor Bharadwaj to continue this webinar. And thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to come in and allow me to give these opening remarks. Thank you very much, Bindu Srivastava. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much, sir, for setting the context and making those very useful opening remarks. Mr. Patak is not yet with us. There is some technical problem, but I would invite Professor Ashish Bharadwaj to start with his lecture and explain, give us the overall context and the overview. Over to you, Professor Bharadwaj. A small introduction to Professor Bharadwaj before we start. He is the founding director of Jindal Initiative on Research and Intellectual Property and Competition, JIRICO, which is the largest academic think tank with a university in India that focuses on technology, innovation, and market competition. He's with the Jindal School of Banking and Finance at Sonipat, and we are looking forward to your presentation, Professor Bharadwaj. I think we've just lost Professor Bharadwaj. There's some connection problem. Let me please sort this out.
Thank you very much, Bindu. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can now. Yeah.
Do you hear me?
Yes, we
Professor,
can
we
hear
can
you.
hear you. Loud.
Bindu, do you hear me?
Yes, Professor Bharadwaj. Please carry on.
Yes. Do you hear me now?
We can hear you very clear, Bharadwaj.
Oh, perfect. Shall I continue if you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you,
Oh,
Professor Bharadwaj.
perfect. All
Please
right. There was just a pin drop silence. So thank you very much for inviting me. Actually, IP and SEPs are a very good distraction from all the unpleasant things that are going on around us due to COVID. I hope everyone's safe. My conversation with Mr. Babu on this topic began several months ago. Mr. Pathak subsequently added his thoughts and views, and I'm very glad that Mr. Ramchand was also able to join us. He's an outstanding contributor to India's telecom industry, and he's building the nation in his own way. I truly want to say that we are lucky to have people like them who have the right mix of visionary leadership, a very inspiring attitude, caliber, and obviously modesty to lead the charge at DOT and be at the helm of affairs. I'm also grateful to other colleagues at DOT, Mr. Subhash Chand, Bindu Srivastava, for spearheading this effort and bringing all of us together. Thank you very much. Before I get started, I want to share something interesting. Professor Mark Lemley from Stanford, he's an authority figure in patent law globally, one of the most cited professors in the world. He has a very interesting line at the end of his email signature, which says, if this email were legal advice, it would be followed by a bill. So please don't treat what I'm saying as legal advice. It's really a summary of the literature, some court rulings, their analysis by scholars and practitioners, and some of them might even be here today. We have about 30 to 40 minutes. I'll try to stick to my time limit, but a fair warning, as an academic, I'm likely to overrun my stipulated time, but I'll still try my best to stay within the time allotted. I'll divide my talk in three parts. I understand that we have a very heterogeneous crowd. People are coming from different contexts and expertise. In my first part, I'll tell you what economists, I'm an economist by training, what economists have to say about technology, innovation, and creation of wealth for societies across nations. In the second part, I'll introduce SEPs and FRAND in a global context. I'll very boldly wear the hat of a lawyer, even though I'm not one. I don't practice law. And in the final part, I'll end with pitfalls and opportunities that Indian SMEs and even startups need to keep in mind when they think about standardization, SEPs, or IP in general. So that's the structure. It's very good news that IP issues have greater public visibility these days. The fact that we are doing this session today says that. Unfortunately, the bad news is that some of it is misguided skepticism, at least in certain sections. So allow me to summarize an entire body of academic work in economics and business that spans 5 decades in 5 minutes. Why this is important is this is really the foundation of what we know today about patents, why they matter to all of us, and why they matter maybe a little more for some countries than others. So technology innovations drive long-run economic growth and prosperity. This is not my renowned economist Paul Romer, who won the 2018 Nobel Prize to establish this fact. Until he received this grand prize, he was serving as the chief economist at the World Bank, helping the bank shape its own innovation agenda. Now, we also know Newton said 350 years ago that if I've seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants. The question that comes to mind is, how do we know whose shoulders? Who are these giants, and where to stand? In this way, innovation, be it incremental or radical, one step at a time, or something which disrupts the entire market, really depends on our ability and capacity to express, share, and utilize information. Management science has a lot to share on this, by the way. Now, capacity and ability in turn are shaped by institutions, which are places where political, regulatory, economic, social interactions happen. These institutions are structured by rules, be it constitution or laws, property rights, or by norms. Norms could be sanctions, customs, code of conduct, and both the institutions and law and rule making are very crucial in making markets function properly. This is again a finding of a very renowned economist called Douglas North, who won the 1993 Nobel Prize for this finding. Now, but for markets to function properly, markets need credibility and they need commitment of enforceability. Now, scholars have shown this through game theory, mathematicians, economists. In fact, John Nash, you might have heard of his name from the movie Beautiful Mind. He won the Nobel Prize in Economics in the next year, 1994, to show how credible commitments and enforcement makes market more efficient. Now, innovation and globally competitive industries, as we see now, last few decades actually, they tend to cluster and concentrate in handful of countries. We don't see them operate the same way in all the countries. So what causes this concentration? They don't concentrate in all of them. That's because of the characteristics of the markets in these nations and how the institutions function. The famous Harvard University professor Michael Porter has spent 4 decades working on this. Now let's come to patents. It's often said that patents restrict competition because they are negative rights. They confer a quote-unquote license to sue. Now this is fundamentally flawed and problematic. Patents, in fact, are meant to structure competition. There's a very thin line, which I'll explain. We tend to forget that there is a free entry into the race to innovation to obtain patents. This is one of the major benefits of the system, to get the latest technologies in time to solve collective problems. But having said this, resources are truly limited, not just by governments, societies, firms, by individuals as well. So limited funds make not just the innovation process slightly challenging, but also getting patents. Now, global innovators in the long run tend to enter and thrive in those countries where the risk of IP leakage is lower. This is again not my claim. This is what the great economist Oliver Williamson, who unfortunately passed away 2 months ago, he said, and he worked on this for about 3 to 4 decades. He received the Nobel Prize to establish this connection in the year 2009. So this is what economics has to say. A question that comes to mind, which is raised by a very good friend and senior colleague of mine, Steve Haber at Stanford. Why did countries get wealthy and prosperous, some of them, and others did not? How did some other countries lag behind technologically or in terms of innovation, or simply just fail to accumulate wealth to be shared by its people? The countries that are now rich and wealthy and prosperous today, they had many things going on for themselves, which is not really practical or doable now, but they had something else going on for them. They had well-developed systems of private property. Why? Because private property, as we understand, would facilitate trade and specialization. Trade would then generate productivity, which then generates wealth, classic economics. Now, the truth is that there are no wealthy countries with weak patent rights, and there are no poor countries with strong patent rights. I repeat, there are no wealthy countries in the world today with weak patents and an uncertain IP system, and there are no poor developing countries that have very strong IP system. It's very easy to draw parallels. When the United States got its independence, Brazil got its independence around the same time. One had a patent system, the other one did not. We can see how the two countries changed. Closer to home, India and China, we can also compare them. They started to liberalize pretty much around the same time when they decided to open up their economies. Different vision, different challenges, different goals, but now we see where we stand vis-a-vis our troublemaking neighbors. Now, the point of all of this is innovation depends on good science as well as good policy and lawmaking. Science is first, of course. And that's why a very sound awareness, effective use, and proper enforcement of patents and IP in general is very important, including standard essential patents. Now, with this, let me get into my second section, which is on SCPs. I don't need to tell this informed crowd a lot about standard setting, but I'll still summarize it so that we're all on the same page. Basically, to understand why is it that there's so many different countries spread across nations are continuously fighting legally with one another when it comes to frontline technologies. It could be mobile communication, it could be wireless, and now 5G in the future. Now, companies that wish to contribute to and participate in the standard development process typically do so by participating in technical meetings of SSOs. They're often ready, armed with their own patents. Some of these patents cover inventions that are essential to practicing the standard, hence standard essential patents. This means that one important role for SSO is to develop a licensing policy for patents that are essential to the practicing of a standard, such that it balances the interest of patent owners or licensors on one hand, and interest of the implementers or licensees on the other hand, so that you preserve the incentive to invest, and you also make it possible for consumers to get manufactured products and good services fairly quickly in time, without any fear of retaliation, from any of the other stakeholders. But the reality is that problems do occur from both sides. Patent hold-up, patent hold-out problems, just to name a few, and I'll discuss these terms in a bit. Now, to preempt these problems arising out of patents, SSOs make patent policies, asking all the companies that own these essential patents to pledge them for licensing on what we call as FRAND terms, fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory. It took me several years to get my head around this concept, so I'll repeat: fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory terms of licensing. A FRAND commitment is a way to ensure access to essential patents in standardized technologies, and we are surrounded by these technologies. Now, despite this framework, problems still occur from both sides. Now, these problems are typically regarding disputes on royalties. Payments of royalties under these FRAND terms, fair terms, is usually an outcome of negotiations between the two parties that I just described. Now, these parties decide on a royalty framework such that the owners receive a fair compensation for what they've built over time, and also importantly, the implementer of the standard is able to get on with his or her business and commercialize products, sell products, make people like you and me happy. Now, what's important to know, I'm sure all of this, all of what I just said is common knowledge, but what's important to know is that a license does not endow the licensee with the technical ability to manufacture a commercial product or carry out an industrial process. A patent license merely gives the licensee a pass on claims of patent infringement from the licensor. Patent licenses are therefore all about risk management, and India and all the stakeholders are doing that. They're trying to assess risk, they're trying to manage a potential risk that may arise due to patents as we work on technologies, including 5G. Now, talking about 5G, I listened to a very interesting webinar just last week where the famous Professor Arogyaswamy Paulraj from Stanford, who I believe is going to be speaking at a TSDSI webinar next week, he said that 5G developments, although they started way back in 2004, 16 years ago, it is not just another G, 1, 2, 3G, 4G. It's not another G. It's evolutionary in its technology, revolutionary in its data services. And I don't need to tell this informed audience about the potential of 5G in our country and in the world. But what Professor Paulraj said that struck me was that typically every year the world spends $100 million, that's about 750 crores, in standard development, which includes the time value of all the thousands of standard engineers and possibly lawyers who work on in the standards process, and they represent some of the big technology companies on our planet, some big research institutions who make technical proposals. They do simulations round the clock. It's a massive global effort. He ended with a very interesting statistic, and I'm sure he's going to share that when he speaks next week. He said that by the time 5G gets done, which is likely to be another 5 years, fully done, the world would have spent close to $800 million, which is about 6,000 crores. On what now? About 1.2 to 1.5 lakh R&D engineers working on 5G. Most of them have very advanced academic degrees, stellar reputation, and really deep subject matter expertise. So this process of collaborative standardization is quite R&D, time, money intensive. It's risky, and it's dependent on some of these experts, including the people we have at our own standards body and in the department. So this was the backdrop. Let me shift my focus to SMEs in the context of standardization. SMEs, as a matter of fact, find it difficult to participate in STOs, particularly in our country. SMEs are the backbone of several economies, including India. They are also backbones of most nations of Europe, nations in Southeast Asia, but they face a challenge when it comes to standardization and the process of it. The potential contribution of SMEs to the development of standards and contributing to the technology innovation ecosystem in general has been discussed in two fantastic papers that I recommend. One is by Kirti Gupta, the other one by Claudia Tapia, two leading SEP experts from the industry. In one of the studies, empirically examined the extent to which SMEs, this is relevant for us here in India, the extent to which SMEs participate in and contribute their technologies to standardization. Are they successful? And how are they successful? Who are they? Now, the study used data set prepared by a friend and colleague of mine, Justus Barron from Northwestern University. This data is from 3GPP attendance records. Very simple, straightforward, easily available. Attendance records, details of companies attending the working group meetings, 3G and 4G standards, the technical contributions submitted by the attendees, and their outcomes. This is the data set. The result is, and they deduce from the data, that the nature of contributors is significantly skewed because the top 10 contributing firms are responsible for more than 60% of all contributions made to 3G and 4G standards. And the top 20 firms almost account for 80% of contributions. Over half of the participating firms do not make a single contribution to the standard, while the majority make sporadic and small number of contributions. Now, they may be contributing in other ways that may not be captured in this data set, but what was captured beautifully vis-a-vis SMEs was that the probability of approval for a SME contribution in standard development was found to be more or higher probability compared to the probability of approval if the submission comes from a non-SME. In ETSI, for instance, SMEs account for more than 25% of all members. Every one out of 4 members happens to represent an SME. And out of all these participating SMEs, 65%, that's a big number, 65% are active in the committees, either as contributors or as implementers. And they also found that SMEs have managed to hold 10% of ETSI working group elected positions, which is another important parameter. It could be a chair position, vice chair, or even rapporteur. Now, I don't have to discuss again in this very well-informed group the benefits of SME participation in SDOs, but I can also think of certain drawbacks of the kind of support systems that we provide in India to SMEs when it comes to standardization. The same problems are faced in Europe. One problem is that the support measures are not really tailored to suit individual SMEs. They look at the collective needs of SMEs. SMEs can be contributors in the process of standard development, but they are mostly implementers of standards because of the challenges and the early stage at which they are in. And I will discuss that a bit later if we have time. Now, it's important to keep this in mind because there are some very serious lessons and implications for how we can do things better when it comes to SMEs and standardization in India. So I'll close my second session here, and I want to start with the next one, where I bring some case law and talk a bit more about law. Now, when the so-called smartphone wars, quote unquote, when they started about a decade ago, requests for injunctions, injunctive relief as it's called, or even damages, were really main and important issues. In more recent years, the attention it turned to the question of abuse of dominant position by SEP owners, alleged abuse, versus issues like unwillingness of a party to take a license as an SEP implementer. And very recently, the focus has now been quite a bit on evaluation of FRAND and FRAND terms itself. And as you all know, as technology is going to progress, you're going to see IoT, these problems are going to become more amplified. And for this reason, we need a very clear legal framework around SEP licensing. We need this certainly in India. We do have some clarity now, but more will be better. But we also need this clarity, this kind of clarity in other jurisdictions like US, UK, France, Germany, China, Japan, so many more. So let me talk about some of these developments, and it's important to know about them, even though we are in India talking about the improvement of our Indian industry, about our nation, but it's good to have a grasp or an understanding of what's going on around the world, since it's such a global industry. One of my professors used to say that knowledge is knowing that tomato is a fruit, but wisdom is knowing to never put it in a fruit salad. So we need to be knowledgeable as well as need to have some wisdom around what the case law around FRAND and SEPs are. Now, the USPTO, their patent office, and the Department of Justice had issued a policy statement on FRAND and SEPs way back in 2013. With the sole purpose of getting more clarity on injunctions, it was important to understand the grounds for injunction and how monetary damages can be sought and recovered. Now, the thinking seemed to have changed now. If we fast forward 6 years, then the statement has been withdrawn. Just last year, a new guidance was released by the Department of Justice along with the American National Institute of Standards and Technology and their patent office, of course. And the policy said that there is no legal difference between SEPs that are committed to fair terms and all other non-SEP type of patents. What this means is that the remedies, at least in the American context, the remedies available under their law, which includes injunction, reasonable royalties, lost profits, enhanced damages, exclusion orders, whatever it is, are also in principle available in cases where SEPs are in. This is, of course, subject to fulfillment of the FRAND commitment by the patent holder. And just 3-4 months ago, earlier this year, maybe in January, I think, even IEEE, the leading standards body internationally, gave their support to this joint policy statement. I don't want to talk a lot about America. They are a very different system, a very different set of aspirations, challenges. So let's move a bit closer. Let's move to Europe. The highest court there, the Court of Justice of the European Union, ruled in a significant and a landmark case, which is called Huawei versus ZTE or ZTE, 5 years ago. And they ruled that negotiations of FRAND license should be made before initiating proceedings towards injunction. And the court issued some rules that the negotiating parties, the implementer, patent holder, they need to follow them. And only if no agreement is reached, everyone goes by the rule book, then the parties can rely on the court system, sue each other, and then think about injunction. So I have limited time to talk about the steps, but I would highly recommend, in case you haven't got a chance to go through this particular case, then please do it. It brings enormous amount of clarity. So I can summarize very quickly. the decision confirmed the basis of the European Commission's approach that seeking an injunction against a licensee who's willing, who's not showing any unwillingness towards taking an SEP, can in fact be an abuse of dominant position. That someone is willing to take it, but for some reason, confusion and misinterpretation around this quote-unquote abuse of dominant situation in Europe. And some people really took it the wrong way and ran away with it. And that's bound to happen. If the only tool you have is a hammer, then everything will look like a nail, right? So SEP owners, and this is again coming back to the Huawei ZTE judgment, SEP owners who make a commitment to a standards body to grant to third parties a FRAND license, they do not abuse their dominant position when they seek an injunction, provided that it complies with X, Y, Z. And these are what the steps are. I think I should discuss these steps if a question is asked, but it's a very important one. So moving on, for more than a decade, the last 8 to 10 years, the patent hold-up theory, I'll explain that, gained traction in continental Europe, where it was said that SEP holders use their market power to extract rents or rent-seeking behavior and make onerous terms to licensees, prospective licensees. And there have, in fact, been instances of abuse by patent holders who've engaged in what is called as hold-up practices. But things started to change in 2017. It was actually a very busy year for Europe. The European Commission set out to establish policies. They were fed up of all of this uncertainty. They set to establish policies to just smooth things over around SEP licensing. Their policy statement, which is also called EC communication, European Commission communication, recognized the need to provide safeguards against holdups, right? Because implementers needed that kind of surety. But the Commission also argued that in the litigation around essential patents, courts should fix the amount of security that implementers should provide as protection against an injunction order, so that hold-out strategies can be discouraged. What is this hold-out? When an implementer does not behave constructively or reasonably and intends to slow down a licensing negotiation, they are really at the risk of being found in hold-out kind of situation in order to avoid a license. So, in 2017, the twin aspects of the licensing dilemma really came out in a big way, focusing on potential bad practices by patent holders and some kind of bad faith practices by implementers. If any one of you is interested in understanding holdout, how is it on the other side of the licensing, on both sides of the licensing table, but particularly if you wish to understand the holdout problem, then I would recommend a case last year which came out of Netherlands. So last year, Netherlands jumped into the FRAND battle, and their Court of Appeals handed down a decision in Philips versus Asus, the computer company. Interestingly, the court provided details of the tactics which Asus had relied on to avoid taking a license. And there are a few other very landmark cases which I would recommend, starting with the old and landmark Rambus decision of the United States, where a very different side of the story came out, and it was one of the first ones. Now, there's another interesting case that came out based on SEP and FRAND, was from the High Court of England and Wales, and it was the famous Unwired Planet versus Huawei decision in 2017. Now, by this time, the Huawei ZTE judgment was out. So the High Court of England and Wales, it ruled that it's possible to grant some kind of injunctions if FRAND terms are not accepted by the defendant. So they tweaked it slightly. So the UK court moved away from what the highest court of EU had laid down as a possible process. I don't want to get into the details of the case, but the point is flexible with the appreciation of whether the various steps have been completed. They found that it is sufficient that the alleged infringer of a patent shows that the alleged infringer is willing to take a FRAND license. It is not necessary that the counter offer that is made by this person or this company is really FRAND in nature. They also said that the determination of FRAND fees to be decided by a judge. They also talked about issues related to geographical extension of the license. The global nature of FRAND license was also mentioned. And it was very briefly, they said that when a FRAND license is set by a court, the scope of the license must be global, right? And a FRAND fee should not be seen as a single value, but as a range of values which gives a window to the negotiating parties. I'm keeping a track of time, but it's a very good time to talk a bit about a very recent judgment from Germany's highest court, the German Federal Court of Justice. It was just decided a few weeks ago in this case called Siswell versus Haier. Siswell is a non-practicing entity. Haier is a Chinese multinational that makes home appliances, consumer electronics. And one of my professors from the Max Planck Institute, Georg Picht, and one of his colleagues offered a very timely summary of this German court decision and their thoughts on it. So here's what they said. When the highest court in Germany handed down its decision, it was the first FRAND-related case it had heard since the Court of Justice of European Union's Huawei ZTE judgment. The patents in suit are essentially for GPRS mobile phone standards, for which the plaintiff had made a FRAND licensing commitment towards ETSI. Then 3 letters were sent in 2012, 2013. The plaintiff indicated that there is an infringement of the patents they're talking about, and it is by the defendant Haier that it's being done. And the plaintiff offered a license on FRAND terms. Now, the defendant's parent company, Haier's parent company, only responded towards the end of that time period after the 3rd letter was sent. And they expressed a hope that they'll be able to enter into a negotiation, and they asked for a discount. Now, subsequently, negotiations started on a license, and it took them several months. Several offers were exchanged in line with Huawei ZTE. However, after the conclusion of an agreement had failed, the plaintiff, in this case Siswell, decided to assert its right in the court. Now, as a first step in FRAND negotiation, the SEP holder need only notify an implementer, this is what the court said, need only notify an implementer of the infringement of the relevant patent. At this stage of the negotiations, the SEP holder need not make any detailed technical or legal explanation of the infringement. This is a very important point which we need to keep in mind as well. The SEP holder, when notifies an implementer of an infringement, then as per decision of the German court, is not obligated to provide detailed clarification on the technicality or the legality of the infringement allegation. In any case, claim charts are added and shared, and they usually suffice. Then the implementer must clearly and unconditionally declare its willingness to obtain a license on whatever terms that are in fact FRAND. Now, if and only if the SEP holder receives an adequate declaration of willingness, this is important, because what was found in this case was that it was really word of mouth kind of a thing, not committed very seriously. But if the SEP holder receives with adequate clarity the willingness to get a license from the prospective licensee, will the SEP holder be obliged to make and terms of the FRAND set up. Now, FRAN terms may also be different for different kind of licensees, but those obviously differences need to be justified. So I'm giving a very, very short and quick summary, but the key takeaway of this most recent and very, very important FRAN decision coming out of Germany was that holdout strategy was really called out loud. And it really brought some clarity on what the SEP holders ought to be doing so that a prospective licensee has more clarity of thought. It was also clarified that portfolio licenses and their worldwide coverage needs to be understood in a very practical and economic sense. And it is, in fact, the duty of an implementer to make its own assessment of the mentioned patents, their infringement, their essentiality, and so forth. Okay, there's a little bit about what the court said, the German court, about the competition concerns or concerns around abuse of dominance, but I will refrain from getting into that. Let's come to India. We're running out of time. There are only two cases that I want to very quickly talk about. One is 2016 Ericsson Lava high-profile case. It was found that the implementer did not make any counter offer and was actually delaying the course of the proceedings, and therefore delaying getting an injunction order granted by the court. So finally, injunction was issued, prevented the standard implementer from importing, exporting, manufacturing, selling any phones that use the patents of the SEP holder, and it was a ruling of the Delhi High Court. Now, another recent decision, Philips was in fact the first organization to enforce its SEPs in India as early as 2009. The matter was decided after 9 years of that in 2018 by the Delhi High Court, which really was the country's first post-trial judgment on SEP and FRAN litigation. It was actually the same time 2 years ago, July. The matter was really related to essential DVD video player patent, and specifically to a channel decoding technology used for DVD video playback function in a DVD device, a video playing device. The court found the essentiality of the patent, the essential patent, and held that the defendant, which really were local manufacturers of standard compliant DVD players, to be infringing on the essential patents of the patent holder. Mangalam Technologies, Bhagirathi Electronics. It was a bit unfortunate. There's so much more that these implementers could have done, and they could have taken a different approach. Okay, so what are the lessons of all of this? We've seen what happened in Europe, in UK, a bit in America, a bit in India. I think what an important lesson was that there are significant challenges that SMEs and small and early stage companies face as implementers of standards. It's a completely different challenge when they have to contribute to a standard, but implementing the standard is also challenging for SMEs. Now, while IP enforcement in general can be costly for patent holders, monitoring of who's infringing, when, how, in what way, that's also difficult and resource intensive. But it's true that SMEs find it difficult to assess whether a licensing offer from a SEP holder is really FRAN. This is challenging. I've had a lot of conversations with Mr. Pathak, Mr. Babu in the past on these issues, and it's a reality even in India, apparently. SEP licensing negotiations are usually confidential, so third parties do not have access to agreed terms by competitors in similar situations. This creates its own problems. Now, an SME that has no experience in licensing negotiations will really have a hard time in evaluating an offer, coming back with a FRAN counter offer, given that resources, time, money is limited. So there are issues that need to be addressed. How do we do that? Perhaps SMEs could benefit from some expert advice provided. It could be by industry association. It could be from accessing a pool of experts who understand the licensing agreements, including determining essentiality, how to make a licensing offer. If they do not like an offer which has come through, then how to make a counter offer. These are technical issues with a very sound legal foundation, and an external outside help can do a lot of good. SMEs interested in the standards process should also keep an eye out on the SDO databases of patents that are declared as potentially essential. The keyword here is potentially essential. So if you are an SME interested in understanding this space, please keep in mind that SDOs publish voluntary declarations of SEPs without really any thorough assessment of the actual essentiality. So one's own examination is very important. It is then in some ways the databases that these SDOs maintain, it's a database of commitment that any of the patents, if they become essential, then they will be offered on frank terms. Now, SME implementers should identify the most important patent holders in the relevant standardization field, and in parallel, consider negotiating a FRAND license in parallel. As I said earlier, there is a heavy amount of skewness in how many of such companies actually contribute to the standardization process and hold true SEPs. So it's not really this a big, gigantic number that they have to deal with. But yes, it does take a bit of effort to get started on these in this manner. Now, this has advantages also. This would allow these SMEs to recognize reasonable negotiation practices and frank terms by themselves. Now, to identify key players in a standards, SMEs can consult reports from, again, specialized firms. This might be an expensive proposition, I don't know. They can even extract information from 3GPP website, showing which companies have made the most approved contributions to a standard. Although not offering one-to-one accuracy in identification of SEPs, the approved contributions give a very good idea of the most important contributors and an idea of where do these strong patent portfolios lie. SMEs should obviously request for claim charts to have a better understanding of the essentiality which is being claimed, and then they have to negotiate after that. And most importantly, which is based on the legal cases that I discussed, try to understand your rights and obligations as established by the rulings of our own courts in India. And if it's possible, then also try to understand what landmark rulings in other jurisdictions, especially in Europe, have said. Now, there are tons of lawyers to do it for you, but it'll be good if you also have an understanding of it by yourself. Without getting into details of the barriers that SMEs face, some of which I've already articulated, I would recommend a study. It's by a professor named Henk de Vries, the Dutch professor. He was my professor when I was doing my law at Erasmus University, Rotterdam in Netherlands. And he did a project to understand, a Europe-wide project, to understand ways in which SMEs can achieve greater benefits from standards and from their own involvement in standardization. You know, they proposed more than 50 solutions to a range of problems SMEs face in standardization. So many problems, which I'm sure our own Indian SMEs face. Which standards are helping my business? How is this standard helping me? Which standards really exist right now? Which ones are in the pipeline that might be relevant to my business? How do I obtain access to those standards? How do I implement them? How do I evaluate them? There's so many questions. They have a big laundry list of solutions. I just want to touch on two of them, since we have some senior people and experts from the government also. In Europe's experience, two of their suggestions were very useful. It was crucial for the integration of standardization in the national education system. It's a national policy that they have now of education and standardization and capacity building at a higher education level. Now, we should stimulate and support the government to develop a similar kind of strategy on education on standardization. As a matter of fact, APEC countries, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation nations, have a national standardization education strategy. In some cases, it's specific to a domain. could be 5G or a domain within it, or it's more broad-based about technical standardization in general. The second challenge that they identified, which might be true for India, is that the global standardization world is perhaps failing to communicate effectively to SMEs in India. You know, they create so many of them. There is so much of information. It's not easy to process all of it. The solution is to develop a communication plan, keeping Indian SMEs in mind. Maybe trade associations play an important role here. The European Committees on Standardization, SENS, and they have created online platforms keeping in mind only SMEs. And they have made it available in different European languages. And ETSI has even collaborated with the European Patent Office to expand its database to include thousands of technical contributions made to ETSI. And it's now considerably easier to access and compare now across these countries. Okay, so this is what things look like in terms of barriers to SMEs, in terms of what we could do to make it easier for them to access the standards process and benefit from it. Just for the benefit of some SEPs or startups who might be present here, I want to just touch upon certain schemes of Government of India that are extremely, extremely relevant and worth discussing, or at least talking about here. One of them is, of course, the fast-track examination of patent applications filed by startups. It's going well, is what I hear, it's part of support innovation and patenting by smaller enterprises and startups, right from raising awareness to reducing regulatory burden, focusing on ease of doing business, but for the smaller entities, reducing the cost of filing patents, fast-tracking examination. All of these are very, very useful steps towards making the patent ecosystem more broad-based. Now, there are other support mechanisms as well. There's funding support now available to startups. There are tax exemptions. There are capital gains exemption. There are exemptions from past experience of turnover criteria for tenders floated by the government. We had a conversation on this earlier. In the government that we need to assist and support our SMEs and startups in a big way, taking small steps now, so that in the near future, hopefully soon, we are able to see them participate in a bigger way in the standards process. I also want to touch upon the effort made by certain selected states in promoting startups, particularly those that are led by women in India. Andaman and Nicobar Islands, it's not a state that contributes enormously in terms of financials, but it's an integral part of our nation. Even they have a policy that gives them, gives startup the monthly allowance of, I guess, 20 or 30,000 rupees on a monthly consistent basis to those startups that are led by women for 1 year at least. Andhra Pradesh has been a front runner in making women-led startups come in the forefront. Startups by women entrepreneurs are provided 100% reimbursement of rent paid for exhibition stalls, both in national and international exhibitions, but limited to a certain space area. Then all universities in Andhra Pradesh provide 5% grace marks, 20% grace attendance for student startup teams which have at least one woman co-founder. Assam has something, even Bihar and Orissa have certain policies keeping in mind women leaders in the startup ecosystem. I wanted to particularly highlight this fact because it's important to realize the contribution that startups can make and the contribution that women can make in general. I have run out of time. I want to finish by just one or two quick things, hopefully by 10:45. Now, I understand that it's not a very wise idea to compare India with North America, India with Europe, or even with China. Land area is different, population is quite different, GDP is different, we have just unique level and variety of challenges we face in our country, and also a lot of promises. And it is widely accepted, including by our government, TSDSI, DOT, that technology is going to help us leapfrog socio-economically, right? Now, when we say that our potential lies in the grassroots in India, um, we need to think about this in a global way. The future of the world economy is really in the hands of select countries like India. So in some ways, we are the grassroots of the world. Certain other emerging markets are the same. So we need to think of it in that way, and think of how we can make it easier for our entities, small or large, to contribute in this big global innovation, healthy competition. Broadly, internationally, thousands of global patent agreements exist. Now, most are negotiated between parties, and if there are disagreements, there are legal remedies available from courts. We only hear about the ones that really go into litigation, which is not that big a number. It's a minority, not a majority. Now, this framework has so far taken care of issues of royalty stacking, patent holdouts, also taken care of unwilling licensee, patent holdouts. And there are so many success stories of licensing arrangements materializing easily without even knocking on the doors of the courts. These patent licenses are not negotiated on individual patent level. They're not negotiated by individual jurisdictions or countries. They are not, and not even by individual product that an implementer wishes to market. And you can imagine why it will be hugely problematic in terms of time and money to do it. It will be like my university asking me to teach the 60 students in the classroom one at a time, rather than taking a lecture for all of them together, right? Now, these patent licenses are really negotiated for multiple patents, sometimes portfolios that are held by different owners, and they are negotiated on a global basis. So we need to develop a culture of which has already started. The fact that TSDSI is taking a lead on it speaks volumes. But we need to understand negotiating benchmarks. So much has been done internationally. There's a lot to learn from them. And negotiations for determining FRAND terms for licensing should happen much before the time when an infringement happens and proceedings initiate. So it is really time to change the mindset. We have already set course in this direction, and I hope we continue in this path. I'll stop here. Thank you very much. I'll be very happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Bharadwaj. And if you can kindly switch on your video. And I'd like to hand over to Mr. Kishore Babu, Deputy Director General, Standards, Research and Innovation from Department of Telecommunications. The very fact that we have a DDG on standards, research and innovation speaks volumes about the government's commitment and recognition of the relation between the standards, research and innovation triad. Over to you, Mr. Kishore Babu.
Yeah, thank you very much, Madam Bindu. Are you able to hear me clearly?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Ashish. It has been enlightening, to hear from you, Indian as well as especially the overseas examples, which are useful for participants. And before, opening it for Q&A, I have just, two areas which I would like to, clarify a little bit. One is about some of the SMEs, their interest is how they can approach large companies who are having licenses. And if there is no response through the normal communication channels, what are the ways and means available to them to get response from the licensors? That is one question. And second question is about you mentioned about it is they should look at the important contributions in 3GPP and other standards areas, where they should look for who have got key role in the standards to identify who are holding the SEP, standard essential patents. So I would like to learn from you, is there any way or database where they can look for these SEPs? These are two my areas of interest before we open the floor for Q&A. Again, back to over to Madam Bindu, could you enable?
Yeah, yeah, Professor Bharadwaj, if you could, Professor Bharadwaj, if you can hear us, can you please unmute yourself and respond to Mr. Kishore Babu's question? I think there's a time lag at Professor Bharadwaj's end. Professor Bharadwaj, can you hear us? May I request the technical support team to please help here? Yeah, thank
I
you,
think
Yeah,
Professor Bharadwaj.
sorry about that. I just realized that when I was speaking, my video was turned off. I didn't know that. I'm sorry about that. Okay, so thank you very much for those questions, Mr. Babu. Now, let me think of an easy way to answer them. Mm, it has been suggested by courts, particularly. I'm saying courts deliberately because that's the most credible way to understand what's right and what's acceptable and what's not. That the first step has to be that the SEP owner should alert the alleged infringer of a patent, designating the claimed SEP and the allegedly infringing product. The SEP owner needs to approach first. Now, in case, I made one of my remarks which said that it might be a good idea for the SMEs to keep a track of what's happening, who's holding what kind of patents, and to try to reach out to them more proactively. That could be a viable approach. I think it's in some cases it comes down to some kind of trust deficit, given that there's been so much of litigation, a lot in other jurisdictions, but also in India. But if there is a willingness, and willingness is a very important term which is used in a lot of these court decisions. If there is genuine willingness and a need to get a license, if there is genuinely a willingness to negotiate on what really frank rate could be within that range, then it doesn't matter who approaches first. And I would recommend the anyone who wishes to implement a standard to more proactively approach, but keep the documentation intact and as comprehensive as possible, because in case things do not pan as planned, then there's the process of how the willingness was communicated, the process of how prospective licensee approached a patent holder, in what form, what exactly, and the words really, the semantics of it, what kind of wordings and terminology was used in communicating this credibility and credible signal. All of this becomes very important in court of law. So a record of everything is very important. Now, and wording is so important because a lot of these, when I speak with licensees, they say that we just don't know what's essential and what's not, and where to go, where to not go to look at them. But it's a very, very there's a big amount of subjectivity initially when we talk about essentiality. And the most frontline models that are used on patent data to understand essentiality are based on semantics. And out of all these thousands of patents in, let's say, 5G universe, out of those, I believe 40,000 are already declared to be essential to the 5G standard. There is so much that they need to do to read each and every claim of the patent. They need to read if the patent claims, if they are in terms of words, semantically similar to the corresponding document, if they are corresponding technical standard document. So that's something I would suggest, and I would urge the SEP implementers to keep in mind. Sorry, could you repeat the second question? Classic teacher problem. You forget the second one.
Yeah, Professor, are you able to hear me? Yeah, thank you very much. The second question is about, where these SMEs can search authentic information about who holds, standard essential patents of a particular solution as a product. Of course, you answered, partly in your response already that perhaps they should search as extensive as possible. But is there any binding or is there any mandate in other countries that is standard essential patent owners who have got enforcement rights in a region or area? Perhaps there is a need, to reflect them in one place to make it easier for people to approach and facilitate. Because of course, what you mentioned, the trust and willingness are very, very critical. But is there any process established in this case already?
I'm only as much as I know. I'm not a technical standards person, but my understanding of how it's done in Europe, particularly, as I said, the two standards committees, SEN and SENELAC, they have search functions on their website that allows one to search the entire collection of published standards, and even the standards that are under development. Now, that is something which I think we could try to do. If you must have seen European Commission documents, they are in 12 different languages because of the linguistic diversity in Europe. We have an even more enormous linguistic diversity in India. So maybe we could also consider going beyond English in this kind of a search platform, where people, SMEs or large Indian companies, can consult the scopes of standard and identify which one is relevant to them and how to approach. What Etsy has done particularly is a very deep collaboration with the European Patent Office. And they have matched in a very, very interesting way. They have some complex algorithms running in the on the back end, which makes the access to all thousands and thousands of technical contributions that are made to Etsy easily available when you're doing a patent search. And this was not there years ago. This they have really done in the last few years. And I know, and I can say this from personal experience, that when we are accessing patents in our own patent office website, it has also improved considerably, but there is still a lot of scope to improve how information is made available in the public domain, which is really at the heart of the patent system. There's no point of giving patents to anyone if that knowledge cannot be used by other people in the company or in the public domain. So I think the solution, to answer your question, it's enabling access through a digital technology intensive manner. Few years ago, I read that our patent office was considering using artificial intelligence based technologies to not just look at examination of patents, but also making them available. Maybe we need to bring that technology now to our TSDSI. See, my camera was again off. There is something with this platform. Is by default, it switches off my mic and camera. Okay, sorry about that.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. Thanks very much. And Madam Bindu, could you open the floor for questions and answers? And I also request Professor Bharadwaj as well as all the participants, though time is approaching, perhaps we can extend it by few more minutes, till some of the more satisfactory solutions or understanding from your end. Is that okay, Professor?
Sure, we can extend it by a few more minutes. I have a call with my Vice Chancellor after 10 minutes, so but okay. We have some time. Okay. I would also, based on what you had suggested earlier, it will be nice if we can do this in another session after some time so that we can get into the specifics of maybe royalties or license arrangement.
Sure, Professor. Thank you very much. So, Bindu, kindly announce for the...
Yeah, thank you very much. So, keeping in mind that Professor Bharadwaj has only 10 minutes, maybe I could read out the questions, and the ones that he thinks he can answer in summary, we could take those. So I'll read out the questions in the order of their arrival of the question. So there's one question from Mr. Nirmal from MBAB Infotech. For startups building on 5G application and products, is it not helpful to have IP which the startup doesn't have to incorporate in the franchise pricing? That is one question. I can, Professor Bharadwaj, in the interest of time, I can read the other question also, which seems to be, which is slightly related.
Please.
Thank you. Mr. Manoj Belgaonkar, Siemens is asking, who declares patents as essential? And there's a third question. SEPs seem to be raise the barriers for SMEs to participate in standardization rather than leveling the playing field for them. What can TSDSI DOT do to support SMEs so that they can contribute to standards and level the access to global markets? So if you could.
Thank you. Thanks for those questions. I will take the second one first. I was not able to fully understand the question by Mr. Nirmal on IP or non-IP, but the question around essentiality is very, very important. In fact, I would like to cite a study of European Union, official EU study of 2017, when they landscaped all the SEPs that are relevant. And they found that only 20 to 28% of patent families declared essential were truly essential. About why it's important to take the process of determining essentiality very seriously. And it takes a lot of time, even for the patent holder who's holding hundreds, thousands of patents, essential and non-essential, to determine internally which ones are truly essential. It's so dynamic. And the cost factor is also quite important, if it's particularly in the Indian context. It was estimated by the same EU study I cited that SEP claim chart reports usually cost about 7,000 euros per patent. That's a lot of money. About 6 lakhs, I believe, Indian rupees. So with about close to 200,000, 2 lakh patents declared as essential in the context of 4G, for example, this number, sum total, would be just too much. Now, so there are definitely questions on the accuracy of essentiality check. There are different methodologies that are undertaken. Claim charts is just one of them. But there are disagreements also. The SEP claims may be essential to several standard specification, but SEPs are declared on an average, 600 odd standard specifications. So it just makes the whole process very, very complex. Now, and you combine it. It's not just the number of patents, but it's number of specification in a standard multiplied by the number of standards and specification plus all of this is done in terms of patent families, not in terms of individual patents. So finally, you have a number which is in the ballpark of 19 to 20 lakhs. Combinations of declared SEPs and the real standard documents with which you have to match and assess it with. So it's problematic. As I said, there are a number of experts, subject matter experts who look into this. Patent office doesn't do it. In-house business or a startup that may have a very grand idea, let's say an e-commerce platform, may not have that kind of skills available. Side experts to, as I said, maybe perhaps a semantic analysis of patent claims with standard. But when you are new to this process, I don't want to call it a game, but when you are new to this, it will really seem very challenging. When you're standing at the base camp of a mountain trek, everything seems very challenging. Once you start taking those steps, you realize that, well, it's doable. And you start to learn the tricks of the trade. So that's about the essentiality. Bindu, if you could please repeat the first question. I think it was important, but I didn't understand.
Sure, Professor Bharadwaj. The first question was for startups that are building on 5G applications and products. Will it not be helpful to have IP, which the startup does not have to include in the FRAND pricing? Or may I request Nirmal to kindly rephrase his question?
Yeah, perhaps that would help.
Okay.
That would help.
While we wait for Nirmal to rephrase his question, the other question, if you would like to take, this is a question from Ms. Pamela Kumar, Director General TSDSI, from a strategy point of view. SEPs seem to be raising the barriers for SMEs to participate in standardization rather than leveling the playing. What can TSDSI, which is a standards development organization, and DOT do to support SMEs so that they can contribute to standards and level the access to global markets?
That's a great question. And it's coming from someone so informed and so senior. I appreciate the question. As I mentioned, I will have to say this in as some may not really appreciating all words of it. I feel that we currently lack a strong culture of negotiation. And that has to be imbibed, that has to be inculcated. Technology now, we are not in the 90s, we are not in the last decade. Technology now in most of the business, including the ones that our small firms and our startups are wanting to get into, technology is just another input. Just like you need a factory floor, you need X kind of personnel in operations, supply chain, this and that. Technology is just another input, just another raw material you need to make bigger and better products, offer improved services to our people, to citizens of the world, and we can proudly say that this is from India. Right now, these two things are a bit lost in the minds of some of our entrepreneurs, if not all. The first one, as I said, is how to negotiate. Do we need to negotiate or not? And whether to treat technology as just another raw material. So I would start from there. When I was, along with my colleagues, we were involved in informing the national IPR policy. We gave a lot of recommendations and comments, and the final document looks fantastic. If you read that document carefully, the very first objective of the national IPR policy is awareness. It's awareness at starting from the most senior level to all sections of the industry, to all sections of academia, all the way to school. And the first thing that it was called DIPP then, the first thing they did was to kick off the awareness campaign through CPAM. And they went really to tier 2, tier 3 cities, started talking to school kids to make them understand all of this. Just like how we want our kids to understand ethics, to understand cultural values and what we as Indians stand for. I think in the same way, we need to tell them a bit about technology and how to do this. But having said that, I would partially agree with Dr. Pamela Kumar that it is at the moment a challenging environment for SMEs to both benefit from the process of standardization and definitely to contribute to standardization. And I articulated some of it in the European context. I know anecdotally, though, that it's the same even in our Indian context. But as some of the studies that I cited have shown, that when the smaller enterprises in Europe started to take more interest in the process of standardization, you do not need to be active contributors of patents. You could simply be another engineer or another stakeholder sitting in those standards meetings, and everything is consensus driven there. There's a lot to learn. It's just like for us as academics, teaching in the classroom, giving webinars or seminars is one thing, but really going out to international conferences and presenting our work to get comments and feedback is when we truly learn from others and improve our own way of doing things. So I think in that sense, really having camera was still switched off. So really having a proactive approach to, marking the calendar that this is when the next meeting is going to be. I'm going to attend it, or I'm going to make my R&D engineer attend it. Start.
Looks like we're having some trouble with Professor Bharadwaj's connection.
Really? Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible now. You're back.
Okay. Sorry, I was just done. Something is wrong with the camera feature. It just shuts off my camera automatically. But yeah, I hope that answers the question.
uh, maybe we might need a little more detailed discussion on this topic. It's a vast area, and uh, just on this at this point, may I bring in Mr. Kishore Babu to talk about the plan to have a series of such webinars, because this the topic of SEPs, IPRs, WIS, SMEs, and the India context is too vast and cannot be handled in just a 1 hour overview session. So the proposed plan to have more such sessions. Kishore Babuji, would you like to kindly
Yeah,
come in here and explain?
yeah. Thank you very much, Bindu. In fact, while discussing with Professor Bharadwaj, he explained the landscape and the intricacies involved, and I mean, however, in spite of best efforts, in an hour time and in an hour and a half, I'm sure that we could not address all the questions and enhance the understanding in a big way. But what he mentioned is about the enhancing awareness from TSDSI front, especially that is a key thing even in the IPR policy from the government of India. We should take it in a big way to enhance the engagement, to make them understand more about the restrictions and concerns, as well as existing provisions, as well as the support from the different departments in facilitating the SMEs and startups. There's a great session, and in partnership with the TSDSA and other stakeholders, we are planning to have more sessions on specific areas, of course, with the kind support from Professor Bhardwaj, as well as experts from the in the related fields. Surely we'll take it forward. What I may also suggest, Madam Bindu, I see that some of the more questions are there in the chat box, which they want, some kind of understanding. Considering Professor Bhardwaj's time, because he has to switch to other call, perhaps these questions we can respond to them offline if we all agree. And also, I request Professor Bhardwaj. He mentioned some of the references, as well as a kind of, necessary readings to understand more about, patent developments, as well as provisions, how they can facilitate SMEs and startups. So if it is convenient to the professor, he could share a document with some of the links we can circulate to the members for their benefit and understanding. This is my request from the audience to
Absolutely.
Professor. And with this, with all your permission, I want to conclude this session. And first and foremost, let me thank all the industry members for their active response and participation in this event, because the program is positioned to support and facilitate your engagement, how you can make as in terms of the member technology, how we can support each other and collaborate with the existing licensors as well as the licensees, so who could take forward with a lot of trust as well as willingness in this important area of building IPRs and as well as patents to facilitate your business and as well as creating wealth. And secondly, we want to thank TSDSI as well as Jindal University, and to really make all out efforts. And of course, there was a lot of support from the my team, Mr. Subhash as well as Mr. Alex, and all of you. I should say that the VC platform. I'm very happy to learn that it's really working good, except a few glitches. I'm sure that they will take care of them in the due course of time. And we want to thank one and all, for making this session fantastic and triggering interest. There are new areas where we can learn and take forward. So thank you very much once again, and we wish you, keep safe, and keep working on the areas of interest, and the questions which are not which are not answered, perhaps we'll get back to you in due course. Thank you very much, and have a good day.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
thank you.
Thank you very
Bindu,
much.
if you could please collate the questions so that we don't lose them, or the
Yes.
comments,
Yeah.
and I'll be happy to share all the references that I mentioned.
Thank you
Thank you
very
very
much.
much, Mr. Kishore, Bindu, for giving me an opportunity. I would love to engage with all our participants one more time. I'm at your disposal.
Thank you very much, Professor Bharadwaj. And before we conclude, I just wanted to acknowledge the presence of Mr. Hari Ranjan Rao, Joint Secretary Telecom, who is in the audience. Unfortunately, because of some glitches, we could not get him on stage during the conference. But thank you very much, sir, for your presence in the conference. It's very inspiring for us to have you with us. Thank you very much. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Madam Bindu, I want to add a small thing before closing. There have been a lot of efforts from policy wing as well as international cooperation wing from Mr. Rao as well as Mr. Patak about engaging with the Department of Commerce in terms
Yes.
of patent building as well as patent support for the SMEs, and also with regard to standardization part in the TSDSA front. And as a collaborative effort, we will take it forward. And thank you very much for all your support during this journey.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye. Airme team, maybe we can conclude, or if people want, you can go and experience a social lounge. We'll keep this platform open till 11:30, and you can please enjoy the social lounge. You can go between tables. I'll come to the social lounge and interact with some of you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Bharadwaj. Thank you, Kishore Babuji.